Hey guys, how's it going? Sam here and welcome back to the channel. So today we're going to be finishing up my Golem painting and discussing how I finish a painting. All the problems, all the things you need to consider, so let's get started. So at this point the painting is almost finished really. I think that the difficult parts are definitely out of the way, and I think it's at a point where a lot of people might stop. Other than the hands, I haven't got the hands in at all yet, which is a problem that I'll come back to later. But the main thing I'm going to be focusing on now is cleaning up edges, working over the 3D to make it look less like a 3D model, adding detail, expanding on the value ranges, changing colours, and adding more lighting. Now, that sounds like a lot, but at this point, everything's really done for me. So as far as cleaning up edges, that is as simple as going through with either a blending brush or an eraser to clean up the edges. I like at this point to start considering hard and soft edges. So if you're sharpening up one edge, are you going to soften another one? And that's kind of worthy of a video on itself, so I won't go into that too much. So that's basically all I'm doing as far as cleaning up the edges for the painting, making sure everything's nice and crisp, making sure everything's resolved. Now throughout this entire process, the main thing I'm thinking is, does this read very well? And is it giving the form that I want it to? So is it clearly the object that I'm trying to create? So with the vines, do they look like vines? Do they have the texture of the vine? Do they have the color that would be suitable for this environment? Do they stand out how much I want them to? And overall in the painting, does it sit nicely with the rest of the design? You don't want it to draw too much attention. I think that's the biggest problem that most people suffer with when they're rendering, is just focusing on that one object in isolation, making sure that vine looks good, and using reference to make that vine look good, and then realizing that they've used too much color, too much contrast, and the whole painting becomes messy and it's fighting for attention because everything is rendered to the same level. So always make sure that you only spend as much time and as much detail on a piece that's necessary. So in this situation, the vines are not the primary read, they're not as important as the head and the hands, so I don't want them to be too detailed. So you'll see I don't spend too much time on them. The other side of that, obviously you still want them to look like vines. So it's a complicated concept. It's hard when you're beginning to get your head around how much detail to add. But if the point I like to view it as, if it's starting to look like the object that you're trying to get it to, stop there. It's good enough. You'll see me jump around the canvas a lot at this point. I don't spend too long in one area. That stops the previous point about something becoming over detailed. I mentioned in the previous part that there is one dominant color in this situation, is blue. So at this point I'm going over the entire piece and kind of touching up colors, adding in more color variety. I mentioned previously to start with 2 colors, and when you've started the painting that's great, but you can always add more to add flourishes. So as an example, in the wood I've added this green tone, which neutralizes the brown slightly, makes it slightly colder, and ties in with the vines and the rock. So I think that's quite important. And they're the kind of details that you can add later in at the end of the painting. You got to remember that you can do the entire painting in stages. So as an example, these hands I created them too late. I should have got them in really early and then rendered them up at the same pace of the rest of the painting. That is definitely my mistake. I wouldn't recommend doing it that way. The reason I did that probably is because I don't like painting hands, so I kept putting them off. I remember thinking I don't really want to work on those right now, so I just left them. I wouldn't recommend it. Get them in, get the things in you think you're going to struggle with, get them in as fast as you can. Do as I say, not as I do in this situation. But if you do have everything in, you can start to block it in as I have at the start of the painting, and at the end add these kind of flourishes, add the colours that need to be added, add the contrast that you want to add. You know, if you want to add some sharper darks into it to make it stand out slightly, or some lights. Remember, you're only pushing it one of 2 ways. You're either making it lighter or darker, or more saturated or less saturated. There's always a spectrum of tipping it one way or the other, so always remember what you're trying to achieve and why. You'll see when I create the hands I do use photo reference. That's not something I've really spoke about much on my channel. I think reference is really important if you need it. I think everyone would benefit from reference. I don't really know a situation where you wouldn't need it. You can always gain some level of information. I mean, just speaking from my own opinion, I can visualize certain things in my head and create them from memory, but nowhere near to the level I would be able to with a photo. So in this situation, you saw me use a photo for the hand. It's just a photo of my own hand that I quickly took. I didn't consider the lighting or anything like that because I knew I could kind of fudge that a little bit with this painting, and I hid the photo quite quickly so that I wasn't spending too much time on it, adding too much detail that I then need to edit. So I kept the lighting relatively neutral and then added some highlights in the blues and the kind of reflection of browns later on in the painting. I've mentioned this previously, but I'm going to say it again because I think it's really important, and that's keeping layers tidy. So in this painting, I have separate layers for the vines, the golem body parts, so the head, the chest, the horns, the leg, the tree in the foreground I have as a layer, the trees in the background I have as a layer, and quite importantly, the blue light in the background, the glowing blue light, I have that as a separate layer, and I make sure that's on top of the background behind the golem, and I don't add any layers on top of that blue layer, because let's say you have an art director who wants that blue light to be reduced or removed. I've got a layer, that's great, I can just reduce it, maybe I take it down to 50%. If I've got any layers on top of that, they're going to be wrong now. They're going to have the wrong values and the wrong colours, because I've used that blue tone as a base to use as a judgment. So if I don't keep any layers on top of it, all my layers are underneath, then if I reduce the blue layer, nothing changes, everything reduces underneath, works absolutely fine, I don't need to make any edits. It's that kind of understanding that is really important as you become a professional and as you start working in a studio environment. You're going to have to remember that you're going to have an art director that's going to ask for changes. Make sure you've got enough layers to allow you to make those changes easily. The other side of it is always, I try to imagine that I'm going to be giving this piece to the art director as a PSD or another artist as a PSD, and they might need to make adjustments themselves. You don't want too many layers. You don't want a layer for every leaf or every vine that I've got in this painting as an example. Just make sure the layers you've got are concise and editable. So all the trees in the background being one layer, that's absolutely fine. You don't need each tree to be a different layer. It might help if they want to move them around, but you don't need that. So don't be the person that has 200 layers producing a gig file that you need to transfer, and it's because you've got 100 layers that all say details. So when you create a new layer, I often create a new layer when I'm painting if I'm doing something that I'm not sure is going to work. And if you're doing that after you've created it and it does work, then merge it down. If it doesn't work, delete it. And always try to keep to a base layer of an object. So if you're adding something that you're not sure the art director would like, as in maybe a texture, keep that on a separate layer and keep it. Label it texture. One piece of advice I would say at this point in a painting, if you're not sure what you're adding or why, then stop. Take a breather, take 20 minutes, take a day, however much time you need to get some clarity on the painting, take that time. If you're not sure because it's a skill level issue and you're just not sure what to do, you're going to need to gain more information. And that's either from watching videos like this, or probably better content, or reading books, talking to lecturers if you're at university. Just try to gain more information, because if you're at a point where you're not sure what to do, it means there's a gap there. And obviously I can talk again about fundamentals, and if you assess a painting in fundamentals and only review, are the values working, are the colours working, that's the kind of information you need. And if you're just not sure on it, then stop. Because if you're just adding details for the sake of it, I can tell you now it's not going to work. It's not going to improve the painting. You always need to know what you're changing and why. So ask yourself that question: do I know what I'm trying to change with this brushstroke? So I've mentioned this in previous videos, but in case you haven't seen them, I'm going to talk about it again. one of the most important things I can talk about, and one of the most important things that I see missing in younger or less experienced artists' work, is the use of adjustment layers. And that includes, for me, normally hue and saturation, color balance, brightness and contrast, sometimes curves if I need more adjustment than brightness and contrast. And I will use those, I mean, you can use them whenever you want, but I tend to use them when the piece is about 75% done. Now, what I've found, if you're using them for individual layers in a painting, that's fine, and you can do that, and then you can merge it down with them and it doesn't make a difference. But I tend to keep them above the painting. And at 75% through, the piece is almost there. You're just cleaning up, really, just adding details where it needs it. You're pushing and pulling information, but you're not making any major changes. And if you add adjustment layers, I've found some artists will get their colors and contrast right first time. Fantastic. If you're one of those artists, teach me. I'd love to know how you do it, but I'm not one of those artists. I tend to get brightness and contrast pretty good, but it's the colors. I always end up pushing it further one way or another, and it tends to add contrast. So if I'm creating on a blue painting, I'll probably end up adding more reds in the color balance. And if you do this, just play around with it. You've got your lights, mediums and darks in your color balance adjustments. I recommend trying them all and just move the sliders to see what works and see what looks better. Bear in mind, your eye gets used to what you've been seeing, so sometimes making a change looks better to your eye, but it's not actually the right decision. So if you're going to do it, I would take half hour off from the painting and then do it, because then you know what you're doing. If you don't have time as a luxury, then you're just gonna have to do it straight away. But yeah, if you do it at 75%, you'll have a good idea of where the painting stands and where it needs to go. Then you can turn those layers off, carry on finishing the painting, and then turn them on again. But because you've had the knowledge of what needs to change, you might start changing them yourself with your painting. So I find doing it at that point really helps me. If you leave it all the way to the end, you can, but I find doing it more naturally without an adjustment layer does actually work better. So you've got more variance in your brush strokes. So as an example, my color balance might end up pushing more towards reds in this painting. I'll turn it off at 75%, and then in that last 25% of the painting, I know I can start introducing more red tones across the painting. And if you do that in a more natural way, you're going to get more color variance and it's going to look better. So one of the biggest questions I've always had, and I see a lot of people post it online, is when to finish a painting. When is it done? And I think the answer is it's done when whatever you're adding isn't really changing the painting. So if you're adding details and it's not really affecting how it reads, then you're done. You don't need to do any more. You can add more, that's entirely up to you. But I often find adding too much, when you go too far, ends up hindering the piece more than helping. Now, it's not straightforward, it's not easy. Everyone will have different standards for themselves and will want different things from a painting, so it's going to be a case of only you can really say. But you got to remember, the main thing you're doing with art is trying to convince someone of a story or a narrative or a concept. And if that concept comes across and people understand exactly what it is and what's happening, then it's done. The rest of it is just edits. It's just changes to make it look better. Now, for me with this piece, I reached a point where I just didn't want to work on it anymore. I felt like it came to a natural conclusion. After I've looked at it once it's been finished, I've realised there are a few edits I would make. The first one being that I would push the back arm further back a little bit more with a blue mist kind of tone. And also I'd probably add some kind of narrative of him holding something. That was the original intention, that's why his front hand is in a fist. I was going to have him holding arrows and then have a few arrows stuck into the wood armour on him. And in all honesty, I just reached a point where I just didn't want to do it. I felt like it didn't really need it. But I think the piece, looking back at it now, probably would have been better if I did. There'd be a slight narrative. Any way you can get a narrative in there that is off camera, I think is really useful, because it suggests that the world is bigger than this painting. So I think that is it for this painting. I think it came out quite well. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you struggle with something that I haven't mentioned, or do you think there's something that I would benefit from knowing on how to finish a painting? I'd love to hear your thoughts on the matter, so drop them in the comments below. If you haven't subscribed already, please do. It gives me an understanding of who's watching and how much they're watching and if the content's enjoyable. Give it a thumbs up if you've liked it, give it a thumbs down if you haven't, and that's it. So I will catch you in the next one.